Welcome, friend, to this gentle journey through the corridors of time, where we'll explore the rise and fall of medieval kings whose stories have shaped our world in ways both grand and intimate. Tonight, as you settle into comfort, I invite you to drift alongside me through centuries of royal intrigue, battlefield glory, and the quiet moments that defined the men who wore crowns. Whether you're seeking rest after a long day or simply yearning to escape into history's embrace, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this peaceful hour together. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, what corner of the world you call home, and what time it is as you press play. There's something magical about how these ancient stories can bring strangers together across continents and time zones, united in our fascination with the human drama that has played out for over 1,000 years. If this kind of soothing historical storytelling brings you comfort, consider subscribing for more journeys into the past that will carry you gently towards sleep. What I'm about to share with you isn't just a collection of dates and battles, though we'll encounter plenty of both. Instead, this is the story of how ordinary men became extraordinary rulers, how power corrupted some while ennobling others, and how the decisions made in candlelit chambers and on muddy battlefields would echo through generations. These weren't fictional characters from some fantasy novel. These were real people who loved, feared, schemed, and dreamed just as we do today. Have you ever wondered what it truly meant to be a king, in an age when divine right and earthly power walked hand in hand? The answer lies in understanding that medieval kingship was far more complex and fragile than our modern imagination might suggest. These rulers weren't absolute monarchs sitting comfortably on golden thrones, issuing decrees to obedient subjects. They were political survivors navigating treacherous waters filled with ambitious nobles, foreign invaders, religious authorities, and the constant threat of rebellion from within their own families. Tonight, we'll meet kings who rose from nothing to claim empires, and others who inherited vast realms, only to watch them crumble through their own weakness or the cruel turns of fate. We'll witness the transformation of Europe from a collection of warring tribes into the complex feudal system that would dominate the continent for centuries. Most importantly, we'll discover how these medieval monarchs laid the foundations for the modern world we inhabit today. But before we begin our chronological journey through the centuries, let me paint you a picture of the world these kings inhabited. Imagine Europe in the year 500, as the last shadows of the Roman Empire finally faded into memory. The continent was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, tribal confederations, and emerging city-states. Roads that had once carried Roman legions now lay broken and overgrown. Cities that had thrived under imperial protection found themselves vulnerable to raiders and invaders. It was into this world of uncertainty and opportunity that our first medieval kings would emerge. The very concept of kingship was evolving during these crucial centuries. Unlike the Roman emperors who had claimed authority through military might and bureaucratic efficiency, medieval kings drew their legitimacy from a complex mixture of tribal tradition, Christian blessing, and personal charisma. They were expected to be warriors, judges, diplomats, and spiritual leaders all at once. Success required not just courage and intelligence, but an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty among followers who might abandon them at the first sign of weakness. Our story begins in the mists of the early medieval period, around the year 481, with a young Frankish prince named Clovis, who would become the first king to successfully unite the fractured tribes of what would one day become France. But Clovis was more than just a successful warlord. He was a visionary who understood that lasting power required more than just military victory. It demanded the creation of new institutions, new alliances, and new forms of legitimacy that could survive the inevitable challenges that would come. Clovis ruled the Salian Franks, one of several Germanic tribes that had settled in the former Roman province of Gaul. The Franks were fierce warriors, but they were also pragmatic people who understood the value of adopting useful customs from the civilizations they encountered. Unlike many of their contemporaries who clung to traditional Germanic paganism, Clovis made a decision that would reshape European history. he converted to Catholic Christianity, not just as a personal choice, but as a calculated political strategy that would give him unprecedented legitimacy in the eyes of his Gallo-Roman subjects. The story of Clovis's conversion has become legend, though like many medieval tales, it blends historical fact with later embellishment. According to the chronicles, Clovis called upon the Christian god during a desperate battle against the Alemanni tribe, promising to convert if granted victory. Whether this moment of divine inspiration actually occurred or was a later invention by Christian chroniclers, the political implications of his decision were immediate and profound. By embracing Catholic Christianity, Clovis aligned himself with the religious hierarchy that still commanded respect among the educated classes of former Roman territories. He gained access to a sophisticated administrative system that the Church had preserved from imperial times. Most importantly, he positioned himself as a protector of Orthodox Christianity against the Arian heresy that many other Germanic rulers had adopted. This religious distinction would prove crucial in his subsequent conquests and in establishing the legitimacy of his dynasty. The baptism of Clovis, traditionally dated to Christmas Day in the year 496, was far more than a personal religious ceremony. It was a political theatre that announced the emergence of a new kind of medieval kingship. The ceremony took place in the Cathedral of Reims, conducted by Bishop Remigius, who allegedly declared that the king should burn what he had worshipped and worship what he had burned. This dramatic moment symbolized not just personal transformation, but the fusion of Germanic warrior culture with Christian Roman civilization that would characterize medieval Europe for centuries to come. With his religious credentials established, Clovis began a systematic campaign of conquest and consolidation that would establish the Merovingian dynasty as the dominant power in Western Europe. His methods were brutal even by the standards of his violent age, but they were also remarkably effective. He defeated the Roman general Syagrius, the last remnant of imperial authority in Gaul, at the Battle of Soissons in 486. This victory eliminated the final obstacle to Frankish expansion southward and demonstrated that the age of Roman rule in Western Europe had truly ended. But Clovis understood that conquest without consolidation was meaningless. He spent years carefully integrating the diverse populations under his rule, respecting local customs where possible, while gradually imposing Frankish legal and administrative systems. He married Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who was already a Catholic, strengthening his religious credentials while forging a strategic alliance with another powerful Germanic kingdom. These marriage alliances would become a standard tool of medieval diplomacy, creating webs of obligation and mutual interest that could prevent wars or provide justification for them when necessary. The Frankish kingdom that Clovis created was neither fully Germanic nor fully Roman, but something entirely new. It combined the military effectiveness of tribal warriors with the administrative sophistication of imperial bureaucracy. It merged the personal loyalty systems of Germanic culture with the universal authority claims of Christian kingship. Most importantly, it established precedents for royal authority that would influence European political development for the next 1,000 years. One of Clovis's most significant innovations was his approach to law and justice. The Salic law, which governed Frankish society under his rule, represented a fascinating fusion of tribal customs with Roman legal principles. Unlike the arbitrary justice that characterized many early medieval societies, Salic law provided detailed procedures for resolving disputes, establishing compensation for various crimes, and protecting the rights of different social classes. This legal framework gave Clovis's subjects a sense of predictable justice that encouraged loyalty and discouraged rebellion. The military organization of the Frankish kingdom also reflected this blend of old and new. Clovis maintained the Germanic tradition of warrior bands personally loyal to their leader, but he also incorporated Roman tactical innovations and siege warfare techniques that gave his forces significant advantages over purely tribal armies. His success in capturing fortified cities like Toulouse and Bordeaux demonstrated the effectiveness of this hybrid military system and established patterns of warfare that would dominate medieval Europe. As Clovis aged, he faced the challenge that would plague medieval monarchs throughout our story: how to ensure peaceful succession in a system where royal authority was still largely personal rather than institutional Germanic tradition, demanded that a king's lands be divided among all his sons. But such division inevitably weakened royal power and invited civil war. Clovis attempted to address this problem by eliminating potential rivals within his own family, including several other Frankish kings who might have challenged his son's authority. These murders, while shocking to modern sensibilities, were viewed as necessary statecraft in an age when political competition was literally a matter of life and death. When Clovis died in 511, he left behind a kingdom that stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. More importantly, he had established principles of medieval kingship that would influence European political development for centuries. The idea that royal authority derived from divine blessing, that kings had special responsibilities to protect the church and maintain justice, and that successful rule required both military prowess and political sophistication, all became fundamental characteristics of medieval monarchy. The immediate aftermath of Clovis's death illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of early medieval kingship. According to Frankish custom, the kingdom was divided among his 4 sons: Theuderic, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clotaire. Each received a portion of their father's territories, along with a share of the royal treasure that symbolized their authority. This division prevented immediate succession crisis, but created new problems as the brothers competed for supremacy and their descendants fought endless wars over the reunification of their grandfather's kingdom. The reigns of Clovis's sons and grandsons reveal the brutal realities of early medieval politics, where family loyalty was often subordinated to political ambition, and where women played crucial but dangerous roles in dynastic struggles. Queens like Brunhild and Fredegund became legendary figures whose feuds and alliances shaped the political landscape of 6th century Europe. Their stories remind us that medieval kingship was never just about individual monarchs, but about extended royal families whose internal dynamics could determine the fate of entire kingdoms. Yet despite the political fragmentation that followed Clovis's death, the Merovingian dynasty continued to expand Frankish influence throughout Europe. The conquest of Burgundy, the subjugation of Bavaria, and the ongoing wars against Visigothic Spain all demonstrated that Frankish military superiority remained intact, even when royal authority was divided. These campaigns also established patterns of medieval warfare that combined personal honor, religious justification, and practical politics in ways that would characterize European conflicts for centuries to come. The story of these early Frankish kings provides essential background for understanding the medieval world that would follow, but it also raises fundamental questions about power, legitimacy, and the relationship between rulers and ruled that would echo throughout our journey tonight. How does a successful warlord become a legitimate king? What obligations do rulers have to their subjects, and what happens when those obligations are ignored? How do religious and political authority interact in societies where both claim divine sanction? These questions become particularly relevant as we move deeper into the 6th century, where the Merovingian dynasty began to face challenges that would test every assumption about royal authority and divine blessing. The sons and grandsons of Clovis discovered that inheriting a crown was far easier than wearing it successfully, and their struggles would illuminate the fundamental tensions between personal charisma and institutional power that defined medieval kingship. The reign of Theodoric, Clovis's eldest son, exemplified both the possibilities and limitations of early medieval monarchy. Ruling from his capital at Reims, Theodoric inherited not just territory, but the complex web of relationships that his father had carefully constructed over decades. Unlike modern politicians who can rely on established institutions and bureaucratic systems, medieval kings like Theuderic had to maintain personal connections with hundreds of nobles, bishops, and local leaders whose loyalty could evaporate at the first sign of weakness or misfortune. Theudoric's approach to kingship revealed the delicate balance that successful medieval rulers had to maintain between strength and flexibility. He understood that royal authority in the 6th century was fundamentally consensual, dependent on the ongoing agreement of powerful subjects who could withdraw their support if they found alternative leadership more attractive or profitable. This meant that every royal decision had to be evaluated not just for its practical merits, but for its impact on the complex network of obligations and expectations that held the kingdom together. The challenge of maintaining noble loyalty was complicated by the fact that Frankish society was still transitioning from tribal to feudal organization. Many of the great families that served Theudoric could trace their ancestry back to independent Germanic chieftains who had voluntarily submitted to Frankish authority in exchange for protection and the opportunity to participate in profitable raids and conquests. These nobles retained their own warrior bands, their own lands, and their own concepts of honor that might conflict with royal commands if circumstances changed. Theudoric's solution to this challenge was to transform conquest from an end in itself into a means of maintaining domestic stability. He launched a series of campaigns against the Thuringians and other Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, not primarily to acquire new territory, but to provide his nobles with opportunities for glory and plunder that would reinforce their loyalty to his leadership. These expeditions served multiple purposes simultaneously. They eliminated potential threats to Frankish security. They provided wealth that could be distributed among supporters, and they channeled aristocratic ambitions in directions that strengthened rather than threatened royal authority. The success of these military ventures established patterns of medieval kingship that would persist for centuries. Successful monarchs learned to view warfare not just as a tool of expansion or defense, but as a form of domestic policy that could unite fractious nobles around common objectives, while providing the material rewards necessary to maintain their allegiance. This understanding would later influence figures like Charlemagne, William the Conqueror, and Richard the Lionheart, all of whom used external campaigns to address internal political challenges. But Theudoric's reign also revealed the inherent instability of early medieval political systems. When he died in 533, the careful balance he had maintained between competing noble factions began to collapse as his brothers moved to absorb his territories and redistribute his supporters among their own followers. The resulting conflicts illustrated how personal monarchies struggled to create institutions that could survive individual rulers and maintain continuity across generations. The period following Theudoric's death saw the emergence of two remarkable women who would dominate Frankish politics for the next half-century: Queen Brunhild and Queen Fredegund. Their rivalry would become legendary, spawning countless stories and serving as inspiration for later medieval romances. But their actual historical roles were far more complex than simple personal animosity might suggest. Both women understood that in a world where royal authority was intensely personal, those who could influence or control kings held tremendous power, even if they could never wear crowns themselves. Brunhild was a Visigothic princess who married into the Merovingian dynasty around 567, bringing with her not just a strategic alliance between two major Germanic kingdoms, but also a sophisticated understanding of court politics that she had learned in the cosmopolitan environment of Visigothic Spain. Her education included literacy in Latin, knowledge of Roman law, and familiarity with the administrative techniques that had allowed Visigothic kings to govern their diverse subjects effectively. These skills made her an invaluable advisor to her husband and later to her son and grandsons, but they also made her a target for nobles who resented foreign influence over Frankish policy. Fredegund represented a different path to power, rising from humble origins to become one of the most feared political operators of her generation. Originally a servant in the royal household, she used her intelligence and ruthless ambition to become the mistress and eventually the wife of King Chilperic, eliminating rivals through a combination of political maneuvering and carefully orchestrated violence. Her story illustrates how medieval courts, despite their emphasis on noble birth and aristocratic privilege, could still provide opportunities for exceptionally talented individuals to rise far above their original stations. The conflict between Brunhild and Fredegund was fought on multiple levels simultaneously, combining personal hatred with broader questions about the nature of royal authority and the proper role of women in medieval politics. Their rivalry involved assassinations, military campaigns, diplomatic intrigues, and religious controversies that drew in bishops, nobles, and foreign kings throughout Western Europe. The fact that two women could wield such influence in a supposedly male-dominated society reveals the complex realities of early medieval power structures, where formal authority and actual influence were often distributed very differently. One of the most significant aspects of this period was how it demonstrated the growing importance of literacy and administrative competence in medieval kingship. Both Brunhild and Fredegund surrounded themselves with educated advisors who could draft legal documents, conduct diplomatic correspondence, and maintain the complex records necessary to govern territories that included millions of subjects speaking different languages and following different customs. This emphasis on bureaucratic skill represented a crucial evolution in medieval statecraft, moving beyond the purely military leadership that had characterized earlier Germanic kingship toward more sophisticated forms of governance. The religious dimension of Frankish politics also became increasingly important during this period, as kings and queens competed to demonstrate their piety and secure the support of powerful bishops who controlled significant wealth and influence. The Church had emerged as one of the few institutions that provided continuity and stability in a world of constantly shifting political alliances, and successful rulers learned to work closely with ecclesiastical authorities while carefully managing the tensions between secular and spiritual authority. The reign of Dagobert, who ruled from 629 to 639, represented the last flowering of effective Merovingian kingship before the dynasty began its long decline into ceremonial irrelevance. Dagobert succeeded in temporarily reuniting most of the Frankish territories under his personal authority, demonstrating remarkable political and military skills that recalled the achievements of his ancestor Clovis. His court became a center of learning and artistic patronage that attracted scholars and craftsmen from throughout Europe, producing magnificent works of goldsmithing and manuscript illumination that still survive as testimony to the cultural sophistication of 7th century Frankish civilization. But Dagobert's success also revealed the fundamental limitations of personal monarchy in an increasingly complex world. His achievements depended entirely on his individual capabilities and energy, and when he died, the fragile unity he had created immediately began to fragment again. His successors, known to history as the Rois Fainéants or do-nothing kings, gradually lost effective power to their palace mayors, aristocratic officials who accumulated real authority while leaving their nominal rulers to perform purely ceremonial functions. This transfer of power from Merovingian kings to Carolingian mayors represented one of the most significant political transformations in medieval European history, establishing precedents for the relationship between royal dignity and practical governance that would influence political development for centuries. The process was gradual and largely peaceful, accomplished through administrative competence rather than military conquest, but its implications were revolutionary. It demonstrated that medieval political systems could evolve and adapt to changing circumstances without necessarily requiring violent upheaval. The rise of the Carolingians also illustrated how successful medieval political families built their power through careful attention to multiple sources of authority simultaneously. Charles Martel, the most famous of the palace mayors, combined military excellence with administrative efficiency, religious patronage with diplomatic skill, creating a foundation of support that was broader and more durable than the purely personal loyalties that had sustained earlier rulers. Charles Martel's Victory over Islamic forces at the Battle of Tours in 732 became legendary throughout Christian Europe, establishing his reputation as a defender of the faith and demonstrating the military superiority of Frankish heavy cavalry over the light horse tactics that had carried Muslim armies from Spain deep into Frankish territory. But the battle's real significance lay not in its immediate military consequences, which were probably less decisive than later chroniclers claimed, but in its propaganda value and its demonstration that effective leadership could still emerge from the Frankish political system despite the apparent weakness of the nominal kings. The victory at Tours also marked the beginning of a new phase in medieval European development, as Christian rulers began to conceive of themselves not just as local political leaders, but as participants in a broader struggle between competing religious and cultural systems. This expanded sense of purpose would eventually culminate in the Crusades, but its origins can be traced to the 8th century conflicts between Frankish and Islamic forces that established patterns of religious warfare and cultural identity that would persist throughout the medieval period. As we move toward the middle of the 8th century, we approach one of the great turning points in medieval history, the transition from Merovingian to Carolingian rule and the emergence of a new form of Christian kingship that would reshape European political and cultural development. The story of how Pepin the Short, Charles Martel's son, negotiated the delicate process of replacing one dynasty with another reveals the sophisticated understanding of legitimacy and authority that characterized the best medieval political leaders. Pepin understood that simply deposing the last Merovingian king would not be sufficient to establish lasting authority for his own family. He needed to create new sources of legitimacy that could justify his unprecedented action while protecting his descendants from similar challenges in the future. His solution involved a careful orchestration of religious and political ceremonies that transformed what could have been seen as treasonous usurpation into divinely sanctioned restoration of effective royal authority. The negotiations between Pepin and Pope Zachary in 751 represented a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy that would establish precedents lasting for centuries. Through carefully orchestrated correspondence, Pepin posed a seemingly innocent question to the papal court. Who should properly be called king? The man who holds the title or the man who exercises the power? The Pope's response, declaring that he who has the power should also bear the name, provided the religious sanction that Pepin needed to justify his revolutionary action. This papal endorsement was far more than a simple political convenience. It established the principle that legitimate royal authority required not just hereditary right or military strength, but divine approval mediated through the Church. This concept would fundamentally alter the relationship between secular and spiritual power throughout medieval Europe, creating both opportunities and tensions that would shape political development for the next 500 years. The actual deposition of Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, was accomplished with remarkable restraint and dignity. Rather than executing his predecessor or allowing him to become a focus for opposition, Pepin arranged for Childeric to be tonsured and sent to a monastery where he could live out his days in religious contemplation. This merciful treatment demonstrated political wisdom while establishing the precedent that defeated rulers could find honorable refuge in ecclesiastical life rather than facing inevitable death or exile. The coronation ceremony that followed marked the beginning of a new era in medieval kingship. Pepin was not merely acclaimed by his warriors in the traditional Germanic fashion, but was anointed with holy oil by Archbishop Boniface in a ritual that consciously echoed the biblical consecration of King David. This religious ceremony transformed Pepin from a successful military commander into a sacred figure whose authority derived directly from divine blessing, making opposition to his rule not just treasonous, but sacrilegious. The symbolic power of this anointing ceremony cannot be overstated. By incorporating biblical precedents and Christian theology into the process of royal installation, Pepin created a new form of legitimacy that was simultaneously more universal and more personal than traditional Germanic kingship future medieval monarchs would all seek similar religious validation, making the relationship with ecclesiastical authorities a crucial element of successful rulership throughout the remainder of our period. Pepin's reign established administrative and military innovations that would provide the foundation for his son's even more spectacular achievements. He reorganized the Frankish army around heavily armored cavalry, creating the military system that would dominate European warfare for centuries. He established new legal codes that blended Germanic custom with Roman law and Christian ethics. Most importantly, he began the systematic expansion of Frankish influence beyond traditional tribal boundaries, conquering Aquitaine and intervening decisively in Italian politics. The Italian campaigns that occupied much of Pepin's later reign reveal the growing complexity of medieval political relationships and the expanding horizons of Frankish ambition. When Pope Stephen II appealed for protection against Lombard aggression, Pepin responded not just as a neighboring king offering assistance, but as a Christian ruler with special obligations to defend the church against its enemies. His successful campaigns against King Aistulf established Frankish hegemony in northern Italy, while creating the Papal States as an independent territory under papal sovereignty. This intervention in Italian affairs had profound long-term consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military objectives. By establishing himself as protector of papal independence, Pepin created expectations and obligations that would draw his successors into increasingly complex relationships with Italian politics, Byzantine diplomacy, and the broader struggle for control of the Mediterranean world. The donation of Pepin, which granted captured Lombard territories to papal authority, established precedents for the temporal power of the Church that would influence European politics until the 19th century. The administrative reforms that Pepin implemented during his reign reflected the growing sophistication of Frankish governmental systems and the increasing importance of literacy and legal expertise in medieval rulership. He expanded the use of written documents for recording legal decisions and administrative commands, creating archives that allowed for more consistent policy implementation across his expanding territories. He established new procedures for judicial appeals that provided his subjects with recourse against local officials, while strengthening royal authority over regional administrators. These governmental innovations were accompanied by cultural and educational developments that transformed the intellectual life of the Frankish kingdom. Pepin patronized monastic schools and scriptoria that preserved and copied classical texts, while producing new works of history, theology, and law. He attracted scholars from throughout Europe to his court, creating an intellectual environment that would reach full flowering under his son's patronage. His support for missionary activities extended Frankish influence into Germanic territories beyond the Rhine, while spreading Christian civilization among peoples who had previously remained outside the Roman cultural sphere. The question of succession that had plagued earlier medieval dynasties was addressed by Pepin through careful planning that combined traditional Germanic customs with new Christian concepts of royal legitimacy. Rather than dividing his kingdom equally among all his sons, he designated his eldest, Charles, as his primary heir, while providing appropriate territories and resources for his younger son, Carloman. This arrangement preserved the unity of royal authority while satisfying aristocratic expectations about the treatment of royal children. When Pepin died in 768, he left behind a kingdom that was far larger, more prosperous, and more sophisticated than the territories he had inherited from his father. More importantly, he had established new principles of royal legitimacy and governmental organization that would enable his successors to achieve even greater things. The Frankish kingdom that Charles inherited was not just a collection of conquered territories held together by personal loyalty, but a genuine state with institutions, laws, and administrative systems capable of governing millions of diverse subjects effectively. The early years of Charles's reign, before he became known to history as Charlemagne, revealed both the opportunities and challenges that faced medieval monarchs in the late 8th century. The death of his brother Carloman in 771 eliminated the potential for civil war over territorial division. while creating new administrative burdens as Charles absorbed his brother's lands and followers. This process required delicate negotiation with nobles who had served Carloman, careful redistribution of offices and rewards to maintain political balance, and military campaigns to suppress regional leaders who saw the succession crisis as an opportunity for rebellion. Charles's approach to these challenges demonstrated the political maturity and strategic vision that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than simply imposing his authority through force, he worked systematically to win over potential opponents through generous treatment, expanded opportunities for advancement, and inclusion in his expanding circle of advisors and administrators. He understood that lasting royal authority required not just the ability to defeat enemies, but the capacity to transform them into supporters who had genuine stakes in the success of his government. The military campaigns that occupied much of Charles's early reign were not merely aggressive expansion, but carefully planned operations designed to address specific threats to Frankish security, while providing opportunities for his nobles to gain wealth and glory through service to the crown. His conquest of the Lombard kingdom eliminated a chronic source of instability in northern Italy, while demonstrating Frankish military superiority to potential enemies throughout Europe. His campaigns against the Saxons began a decades-long struggle that would ultimately extend Christian civilization deep into Germanic territories that had never acknowledged Roman authority. These Saxon wars, which would continue intermittently for over 30 years, revealed both the possibilities and limitations of medieval military power. Charles possessed advantages in organization, equipment, and strategic resources that made Frankish victory almost inevitable in major battles. But the nature of Saxon society and the geography of their territories made lasting conquest extremely difficult to achieve. The Saxons fought not as a unified kingdom under centralized leadership, but as a confederation of tribes and local communities that could continue resistance even after major defeats had eliminated their organized military forces. Charles's solution to this challenge involved a combination of military pressure, administrative innovation, and religious conversion that transformed the nature of medieval conquest. Rather than simply defeating Saxon armies and imposing Frankish tribute, he worked systematically to replace Saxon social and religious institutions with Christian alternatives that would create new loyalties and new forms of organization compatible with Frankish political systems. This approach required not just military commanders, but missionaries, administrators, and colonists who could establish the infrastructure necessary for permanent political transformation. The forced conversion of the Saxon population represented one of the most controversial aspects of Charles's reign, involving methods that were brutal even by medieval standards. Thousands of Saxon nobles were executed or exiled for refusing to accept Christian baptism, while entire communities were relocated to prevent the maintenance of traditional religious practices. These policies achieved their immediate objectives by eliminating organized resistance to Frankish rule, but they also created lasting resentment that would influence German political development for centuries. The religious dimension of Charles's conquests reflected broader changes in medieval Christian thought about the proper relationship between political authority and spiritual mission. Unlike earlier Germanic kings, who had converted to Christianity primarily for political advantage, Charles appears to have genuinely believed that he had divine obligations to extend Christian civilization to pagan peoples, even if this required the use of force against those who resisted conversion. This sense of religious mission would later influence the development of crusading ideology and provide justification for European expansion into non-Christian territories throughout the medieval period. The administrative challenges created by Charles's expanding empire required innovations in governmental organization that would influence European political development for centuries. Traditional Frankish methods of personal rule through direct relationships with local nobles were inadequate for governing territories that stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. Charles responded by creating new administrative districts called counties each governed by appointed officials who were responsible directly to royal authority rather than to local aristocratic hierarchies. This county system represented a significant evolution in medieval governmental organization, establishing principles of centralized administration and bureaucratic accountability that would later be adopted throughout Europe. County officials were expected to maintain written records of their activities, submit regular reports to royal inspectors, and participate in annual assemblies where policies were discussed and administrative problems addressed. This system provided Charles with unprecedented control over local governance, while creating career opportunities for educated administrators who could advance through merit rather than birth alone. The cultural and intellectual achievements of Charles's court reflected the growing sophistication of Frankish civilization and the expanding horizons of medieval Christian thought. He attracted scholars from throughout Europe to his palace school, creating an intellectual environment that produced advances in theology, law, literature, and natural philosophy. The Carolingian Renaissance that flourished under his patronage preserved and transmitted classical learning, while developing new forms of artistic and literary expression that would influence European culture for centuries. The educational reforms implemented during Charles's reign had lasting impact on European intellectual development. He mandated the establishment of schools in cathedral and monastic centers throughout his empire, creating educational opportunities for both clerical and lay students. He standardized curricula that emphasized literacy, numeracy, and basic theological knowledge, while encouraging the development of local libraries and scriptoria. These educational initiatives created a literate class that could staff the expanding governmental bureaucracy while preserving and transmitting the cultural heritage of Christian civilization. The legal reforms that Charles implemented reflect his understanding that effective governance required consistent and predictable judicial procedures that could command respect from diverse populations with different customary practices. He commissioned the systematic compilation of existing Frankish laws while incorporating elements from Roman legal tradition and Christian ethical teaching. The resulting legal codes provided clearer guidance for judges and administrators, while establishing principles of justice that emphasized royal responsibility for protecting the weak against oppression by the powerful. The coronation of Charles as Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800 represented the culmination of his remarkable reign and the beginning of a new chapter in medieval European history. This unprecedented ceremony, conducted by Pope Leo III in St. Peter's Basilica, created a new form of imperial authority that combined Frankish military power with Roman political tradition and Christian religious sanction. The event marked the formal restoration of Western imperial dignity after more than 3 centuries of fragmentation following the fall of the last Western Roman emperors. The circumstances surrounding Charles's imperial coronation reveal the complex political calculations that influenced major decisions in medieval Europe. Pope Leo III, facing serious challenges to his authority from Roman aristocratic factions, needed powerful military protection that only Charles could provide. Charles, despite his later claims of surprise at the papal initiative, had been preparing for expanded imperial responsibilities through diplomatic contacts with Constantinople and administrative reforms that anticipated governance of a truly universal Christian empire. The immediate consequences of the imperial coronation extended far beyond the personal honor accorded to Charles himself. By reviving the Western imperial title, the ceremony created new possibilities for European political organization while establishing precedents that would influence imperial-papal relations for centuries. Future medieval emperors would all seek similar religious validation for their authority, while popes would claim the right to judge imperial worthiness and, if necessary, to transfer imperial dignity to more suitable candidates. The administrative challenges of governing a truly imperial territory required Charles to develop new institutions and procedures that went beyond the county system he had created for ruling the Frankish kingdom. He established a network of imperial inspectors who traveled throughout the empire, monitoring local administration, investigating complaints against officials, and ensuring compliance with imperial policies. These missi dominici, as they were called, provided direct links between central authority and local governance, while creating opportunities for capable administrators to advance through imperial service. The military organization of the Carolingian Empire reflected the need to defend vast frontiers against multiple enemies, while maintaining internal security across diverse populations with different languages, customs, and potential loyalties. Charles created a system of frontier marches governed by specially appointed officials with expanded authority to respond to external threats without waiting for imperial approval. These march commanders became powerful regional leaders who would eventually evolve into the territorial princes, who would dominate later medieval European politics. As Charles aged and began to contemplate the succession arrangements that would determine the future of his empire, he faced the same fundamental challenge that had confronted every medieval ruler: how to preserve political unity while satisfying the legitimate expectations of royal children and powerful nobles who had contributed to imperial success. His initial plans called for dividing the empire among his 3 sons, following traditional Frankish custom, but the deaths of 2 of his designated heirs left his surviving son Louis as sole inheritor of imperial authority. This unexpected consolidation of imperial succession created opportunities for continued political unity while establishing precedents that would influence later medieval concepts of imperial dignity and territorial integrity. Louis, who would become known as Louis the Pious, inherited not just vast territories and impressive military resources, but also the complex web of relationships, obligations, and expectations that his father had created during more than 4 decades of remarkably successful rule. The legacy of Charlemagne's reign extended far beyond the immediate political and territorial achievements that made him the most successful medieval ruler of his era. He had demonstrated that effective government could extend across linguistic and cultural boundaries, that Christian civilization could provide unifying principles for diverse populations, and that individual leadership could create institutions capable of surviving dynastic transitions and political challenges. His example would inspire medieval rulers for centuries, while establishing standards of royal achievement that few would equal and none would surpass. The death of Charlemagne in 814 marked the end of an era, but the empire he had built would continue to shape European destiny for generations. As you settle deeper into comfort tonight, let us follow the complex story of how his son Louis the Pious inherited the most powerful realm in Christendom, only to watch it fracture under the weight of competing ambitions and irreconcilable differences that would ultimately give birth to the nations we recognize today. Louis came to the throne with advantages that no medieval ruler before him had possessed. He inherited an administrative system that functioned effectively across vast distances, a military organization capable of defending multiple frontiers simultaneously, and a cultural renaissance that had elevated the Frankish court to unprecedented heights of learning and sophistication. Yet within a generation, this magnificent imperial structure would fragment into competing kingdoms whose rulers would spend centuries fighting each other rather than building upon their grandfather's achievements. The tragedy of Louis the Pious lies not in any fundamental weakness of character, but in his sincere attempt to reconcile Christian principles with the brutal realities of medieval politics. Unlike his father, who had balanced piety with pragmatic ruthlessness, Louis believed that imperial authority should be exercised according to strict moral principles that emphasize justice, mercy, and the protection of the weak. These admirable intentions would prove catastrophically unsuited to the harsh world of 9th century European politics. Louis's approach to governance reflected the growing influence of ecclesiastical advisors who viewed the Carolingian Empire as a Christian commonwealth that should embody divine principles of justice and righteousness. He implemented legal reforms designed to protect peasants from aristocratic exploitation, established new procedures for judicial appeals that emphasized fairness over expedience, and attempted to regulate the conduct of royal officials according to strict moral standards. These policies were admirable in theory, but created practical problems that would ultimately undermine imperial authority. The religious reforms that Louis championed revealed both his genuine piety and his political naivety. He mandated stricter observance of canonical law among the clergy, supported monastic reforms that emphasized spiritual discipline over worldly concerns, and attempted to eliminate what he viewed as pagan survivals in popular religious practice. While these initiatives enhanced the spiritual dignity of his reign, they also alienated powerful bishops who had grown comfortable with more flexible interpretations of ecclesiastical law and created tensions with noble families whose traditional customs were suddenly deemed incompatible with Christian civilization. The succession crisis that would ultimately destroy Carolingian unity began with Louis's decision to remarry after the death of his first wife in 818. His marriage to Judith of Bavaria was politically motivated, designed to strengthen imperial connections with powerful Bavarian families. But it created unexpected complications when Judith gave birth to a son named Charles in 823. This child's arrival disrupted the careful succession arrangements that Louis had previously established among his older sons, creating dynastic tensions that would prove impossible to resolve peacefully. The Ordinatio Imperii of 817, which Louis had issued to clarify imperial succession, had seemed to provide a stable framework for preserving political unity after his death. His eldest son Lothair was designated as co-emperor and primary heir, while his younger brothers Louis and Pepin received substantial kingdoms that would remain subordinate to imperial authority. This arrangement attempted to balance traditional Frankish practices of territorial division with the newer concept of indivisible imperial dignity that Charlemagne had established. However, the birth of Charles the Bald forced Louis to reconsider these arrangements, since Frankish custom demanded that all royal sons receive appropriate territorial provisions. The emperor's attempts to create a suitable kingdom for his youngest son inevitably reduced the inheritances promised to his older children, creating resentment and suspicion that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The complex negotiations and territorial adjustments that followed revealed the fundamental incompatibility between imperial unity and traditional Germanic succession practices. The rebellion of 830, led by Louis's older sons with support from disaffected nobles and bishops, represented one of the most dramatic political crises in medieval European history. For the first time since the establishment of Carolingian authority, a reigning emperor was actually deposed and imprisoned by his own children, demonstrating how quickly royal authority could collapse when family loyalty was subordinated to political ambition. Although Louis was eventually restored to power, the precedent of successful rebellion against imperial authority would encourage future challenges to Carolingian rule. The psychological impact of this temporary deposition transformed Louis from a confident ruler into an increasingly indecisive monarch who struggled to balance competing demands from his sons while maintaining effective governance of his vast territories. His attempts to satisfy all parties through repeated territorial redistributions created chronic instability that prevented the development of coherent policies for addressing the empire's growing external threats. Viking raiders began to probe Frankish defences along the northern coasts, while Magyar horsemen launched devastating attacks against the eastern frontiers. The Treaty of Verdun in 843, negotiated among Louis's surviving sons after his death in 840, formally divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 separate kingdoms that would eventually evolve into France, Germany, and Italy. This partition was presented as a temporary arrangement that preserved the theoretical unity of the empire while providing practical solutions to dynastic competition. But in reality, it marked the permanent fragmentation of Charlemagne's achievement and the beginning of centuries of warfare among his descendants. Louis the German, who received the Eastern Kingdom, inherited territories that included modern Germany, Austria, and portions of Eastern Europe that had been conquered during Charlemagne's Saxon campaigns. His realm faced constant pressure from Slavic tribes and Magyar raiders, who recognized that the division of imperial authority had created new opportunities for territorial expansion. Louis responded to these challenges by developing military innovations that emphasized heavily armored cavalry, supported by professional infantry units, creating tactical systems that would influence German warfare for centuries. Charles the Bald, ruling the Western Kingdom that would become France, confronted even more serious external threats as Viking raiders established permanent bases along the Seine and Loire rivers. These Scandinavian warriors possessed advantages in mobility and surprise that made traditional Frankish military responses inadequate, forcing Charles to develop new defensive strategies that combined fortified positions with rapid response forces. His struggles against Viking incursions revealed both the resilience and limitations of Carolingian governmental systems under extreme pressure. Lothair, who retained the imperial title along with a central kingdom stretching from the North Sea to central Italy, faced the impossible task of maintaining imperial dignity while governing territories that lacked geographical coherence or shared cultural identity. His realm included French-speaking regions in the north, German-speaking areas along the Rhine, and Italian territories with their own distinct political traditions. This artificial political creation would prove unsustainable, fragmenting further after Lothair's death in 855 and creating the complex patchwork of competing principalities that would characterize medieval European politics. The cultural consequences of Carolingian fragmentation were as significant as the political divisions that captured contemporary attention. The unified intellectual environment that had flourished under Charlemagne's patronage gave way to regional centers of learning that developed distinct scholarly traditions and cultural identities. The palace school that had once attracted the best minds from throughout Europe was replaced by competing courts that used cultural patronage to assert their political legitimacy and attract talented individuals who might otherwise have served rival dynasties. The Viking raids that intensified throughout the 9th century represented more than simple military challenges to Carolingian authority. These Scandinavian expeditions revealed fundamental weaknesses in the governmental systems that Louis the Pious and his successors had inherited from Charlemagne. The county administration that had functioned effectively during periods of imperial unity proved inadequate for coordinating defensive responses when royal authority was divided among competing rulers who prioritized dynastic interests over collective security. The siege of Paris in 885 to 886 illustrated both the vulnerability of Carolingian territories to external attack and the emergence of new forms of local leadership that would eventually replace imperial authority throughout much of Western Europe. Count Odo of Paris, who organized the city's successful defense against Viking assault, demonstrated that effective military leadership could emerge from regional nobles who possessed the resources and determination to protect their territories when imperial assistance proved unavailable or inadequate. The gradual rise of territorial principalities during the late 9th and early 10th centuries reflected broader changes in European society that made traditional forms of royal authority increasingly obsolete. Local nobles who possessed fortified positions, trained military forces, and administrative capabilities began to assume governmental responsibilities that imperial officials could no longer fulfill effectively. This transformation created new political structures that were more responsive to immediate threats, but less capable of coordinating large-scale policies or maintaining cultural unity across extensive territories. The emergence of feudalism as the dominant form of social and political organization represented an adaptation to the practical realities of European life, in an age when central authority had collapsed and local self-defense had become essential for survival. The complex web of personal relationships between lords and vassals that characterized feudal society provided security and order when traditional governmental institutions proved inadequate, but it also created new forms of fragmentation that would persist for centuries. The military innovations that developed during this period of political fragmentation reflected the changing nature of European warfare and the growing importance of heavily armored cavalry in medieval military systems. The development of improved horse breeding, more effective weapons and armor, and new tactical formations transformed European armies from the infantry-based forces that had served Charlemagne into the mounted warriors who would dominate medieval battlefields for the next 4 centuries. The castle-building revolution that swept across Europe during the 10th and 11th centuries provided both defensive capabilities and symbols of aristocratic authority that would fundamentally alter the European landscape. These fortified residences served multiple functions simultaneously, providing military bases for territorial control, administrative centers for local governance, and cultural symbols that demonstrated noble power and prestige. The investment required to construct and maintain these fortifications created new forms of economic organization, while establishing physical foundations for the decentralized political systems that would characterize medieval Europe. The economic changes that accompanied political fragmentation included the decline of long-distance trade networks that had flourished under Carolingian protection, and the emergence of more localized commercial systems that reflected the reduced scale of political organization. Towns and cities that had thrived as administrative centers for imperial governance adapted to new roles as regional markets and craft production centers, developing forms of urban organization that would eventually challenge the rural-based feudal system. The religious developments of this period reflected both continuity with Carolingian traditions and adaptation to new political realities. Monastic communities that had flourished under imperial patronage found themselves increasingly dependent on local noble families for protection and support, creating new relationships between spiritual and secular authority that would influence ecclesiastical development for centuries. The emergence of proprietary churches, where local nobles controlled appointments and resources, represented a significant departure from earlier attempts to maintain clerical independence from secular interference. The intellectual traditions established during the Carolingian Renaissance survived the political fragmentation of the empire, but were transformed by the new circumstances in which scholars and educators found themselves. Regional courts and monastic centers became the primary patrons of learning, creating diverse intellectual environments that developed distinct approaches to theology, philosophy, and natural knowledge. This decentralization of scholarly activity ultimately proved beneficial for European intellectual development, encouraging innovation and experimentation that might not have occurred under more centralized imperial control. The manuscript tradition that preserved and transmitted classical and Christian texts adapted to the new political realities through the development of regional scriptoria that specialized in different types of literary and scholarly production. Irish monasteries became renowned for their preservation of classical texts, while German centers excelled in theological scholarship, and Italian institutions maintained connections with Byzantine intellectual traditions. This geographic specialization created networks of scholarly communication that transcended political boundaries, while maintaining the cultural unity that political fragmentation had destroyed. The legal traditions established during the Carolingian period continued to influence European development even as political authority became increasingly localized. The legal codes compiled under Charlemagne and Louis the Pious provided foundations for later medieval law, while adapting to new circumstances through local interpretation and application. The emergence of customary law as the dominant legal tradition reflected the growing importance of local practices and regional variations in social organization. The transformation of European society during the 9th and 10th centuries created new opportunities for individual advancement and social mobility that had been limited under more centralized imperial systems. Local nobles who demonstrated military competence and administrative ability could rise rapidly in status and wealth, while merchants and craftsmen found new markets and opportunities in the emerging urban centers. This increased social fluidity would eventually contribute to the dynamic quality that characterized later medieval civilization. As we approach the end of the 10th century, we witness the emergence of new royal dynasties that would attempt to restore the unity and authority that the Carolingians had lost. The rise of the Ottonian dynasty in Germany, the establishment of Capetian rule in France, and the continued evolution of Italian political structures would create new possibilities for European development while building upon the foundations that Charlemagne and his successors had established. These new rulers would face many of the same challenges that had confronted their predecessors, but they would bring different solutions and create different legacies that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. The story of how medieval kingship evolved from the tribal leadership of early Germanic society to the sophisticated imperial systems of the Carolingian period, and then adapted to the decentralized realities of feudal Europe, reveals the remarkable flexibility and resilience of European political traditions. Each generation of rulers faced unique challenges and opportunities that required new approaches to governance, military organization, and cultural patronage. Their successes and failures created the complex tapestry of medieval European civilization that would provide the foundation for modern European development. Tonight, as you drift toward peaceful sleep, remember that these ancient struggles and achievements continue to influence our world in ways both obvious and subtle. The governmental institutions, legal traditions, cultural values, and social structures that we take for granted today were forged in the crucible of medieval European politics by men and women whose names have echoed through the centuries. Their stories remind us that human societies are constantly evolving, adapting to new challenges while preserving the wisdom and achievements of previous generations. The medieval kings whose reigns we have followed tonight were neither superhuman heroes nor cartoonish villains, but complex individuals who struggled with the same fundamental questions about power, responsibility, and legacy that continue to challenge leaders today. Their examples provide both inspiration and warning, demonstrating the possibilities for human achievement while revealing the dangers of unchecked ambition and the inevitable consequences of political failure. As the 10th century dawned across Europe, a new generation of rulers emerged from the ashes of Carolingian collapse, each carrying within them the seeds of kingdoms that would reshape the medieval world. The fragmentation that had seemed so catastrophic to contemporary observers would prove to be not an ending, but a transformation that allowed European civilization to develop along multiple paths simultaneously, creating the rich diversity of political traditions that would define the continent for centuries to come. In the German lands east of the Rhine, Henry the Fowler assumed the crown in 919, establishing the Ottonian dynasty that would restore imperial dignity to Central Europe while developing distinctly German approaches to royal authority. Henry understood that effective kingship in the post-Carolingian world required different skills and strategies than those that had served Charlemagne and his immediate successors. The old imperial bureaucracy had largely collapsed, leaving regional nobles with unprecedented autonomy, while external threats from Magyar raiders and Slavic tribes demanded immediate military responses that could not wait for complex diplomatic negotiations or elaborate administrative procedures. Henry's approach to these challenges revealed a pragmatic understanding of political realities that would characterize successful medieval rulers throughout our remaining journey. Rather than attempting to restore centralized imperial control through force, he worked systematically to build coalitions among regional dukes and counts who shared common interests in defending their territories against external enemies. His military reforms emphasized the construction of fortified towns that could serve as bases for cavalry forces while providing protection for local populations during Magyar raids. The defensive strategy that Henry developed combined Germanic military traditions with innovations learned from fighting against nomadic enemies whose tactics were entirely different from those employed by traditional European armies. He established a system of military service that required nobles to maintain trained cavalry forces in exchange for royal grants of land and privileges, creating the foundations for the feudal military organization that would dominate European warfare for the next 3 centuries. Henry's son Otto, who succeeded to the German throne in 936, inherited both his father's political wisdom and an expanded understanding of the possibilities for royal authority in the changing European environment. Otto the Great, as history would remember him, possessed the vision and determination necessary to restore imperial dignity while adapting ancient institutions to contemporary realities. His reign would demonstrate that effective medieval kingship required not just military prowess and political cunning, but genuine understanding of the cultural and spiritual forces that motivated human behavior, in an age when religious belief provided the primary framework for interpreting worldly events. The early years of Otto's reign were dominated by rebellions from regional nobles who tested the new king's resolve and capabilities, following patterns that had become typical in post-Carolingian Europe. These conflicts were not merely personal disputes over territorial control, but fundamental challenges to the entire concept of royal authority that required Otto to demonstrate both his military competence and his political legitimacy through decisive action. His victories over rebellious dukes at the battles of Berten and Andernach established his reputation as a formidable warrior, while revealing the tactical innovations that would make German armies the most effective military forces in 10th century Europe. The Magyar invasions that had terrorized Europe for nearly a century reached their climax during Otto's reign. As these nomadic warriors launched increasingly ambitious campaigns that penetrated deep into German territory and threatened the very survival of Christian civilization in Central Europe. The Battle of Lechfeld in 955 would prove to be one of the decisive moments in medieval European history, not just because of its immediate military consequences, but because of its broader implications for European political development and cultural identity. Otto's victory over the Magyar forces was achieved through careful preparation, innovative tactics, and personal leadership that inspired his followers to extraordinary efforts in defense of their homeland and their faith. The German army that triumphed at Lechfeld combined the disciplined formations of professional cavalry with the desperate courage of men fighting for everything they held dear. The battle demonstrated that European military systems had evolved sufficiently to defeat nomadic enemies who had previously seemed invincible, while establishing Otto's reputation as a defender of Christendom who deserved imperial recognition. The aftermath of Lechfeld transformed European political relationships by eliminating the Magyar threat that had prevented stable governmental development throughout Central Europe for generations. With the nomadic menace finally defeated, regional nobles could redirect their energies from purely defensive concerns toward more constructive projects of territorial consolidation, economic development, and cultural patronage. The victory also established Otto's credentials as a worthy successor to Charlemagne, creating expectations for imperial restoration that would shape the remainder of his reign. The Italian campaigns that occupied much of Otto's later career reflected both his personal ambitions and the broader dynamics of European political development in the 10th century. Unlike Charlemagne's interventions in Italian affairs, which had been motivated primarily by papal appeals for protection against Lombard aggression, Otto's involvement south of the Alps was driven by his vision of restored imperial authority that could unite Christian Europe under German leadership, while maintaining the religious sanction that legitimized medieval royal power. The political situation in Italy during the mid-10th century was extraordinarily complex, with competing factions among Roman nobles, ambitious Lombard princes, and Byzantine officials, all maneuvering for advantage, while papal authority fluctuated according to the personal capabilities and political connections of individual popes. Otto recognized that effective intervention in this chaotic environment required not just military force, but sophisticated diplomatic skills and genuine understanding of Italian political traditions that differed significantly from Germanic customs. The marriage alliance that Otto arranged between his son and the Byzantine princess Theophanu revealed his understanding that successful imperial policy required integration with broader Mediterranean political systems, rather than simple domination through military conquest. This diplomatic initiative created connections between German and Byzantine courts that would influence European development for centuries, while demonstrating that 10th century rulers possessed far more sophisticated approaches to international relations than their early medieval predecessors. The imperial coronation of Otto by Pope John XII in 962 represented both the culmination of his remarkable reign and the beginning of a new chapter in the complex relationship between secular and spiritual authority that would define medieval European politics. Unlike Charlemagne's coronation, which had surprised contemporary observers and created precedents that were still being interpreted, Otto's imperial elevation was carefully planned and thoroughly negotiated, reflecting the accumulated wisdom of nearly 2 centuries of experience, with the practical implications of restored imperial dignity. The Ottonian Empire that emerged from these developments differed significantly from its Carolingian predecessor in both its geographical extent and its administrative organization. While Charlemagne had ruled territories stretching from Spain to Poland, Otto's authority was more concentrated, but also more intensive, focusing on the German heartland while extending imperial influence into Italy and Eastern Europe through carefully managed alliances and tributary relationships. This more limited but more coherent territorial base would prove more sustainable than the unwieldy Carolingian domains that had proved impossible to govern effectively. The administrative innovations that Otto implemented reflected lessons learned from Carolingian failures while adapting to the changed circumstances of 10th century European society. Rather than attempting to recreate the county system that had served Charlemagne, Otto worked through existing ducal and episcopal structures, strengthening royal authority through personal relationships and mutual obligations rather than bureaucratic control. This approach proved more flexible and responsive to local conditions, while maintaining the essential elements of royal authority necessary for effective governance. The ecclesiastical policies that Otto pursued throughout his reign demonstrated his understanding that successful medieval kingship required close cooperation with religious authorities who commanded resources and influence that no secular ruler could ignore. His appointments of bishops and abbots reflected both political calculations and genuine concern for spiritual welfare, creating a synthesis of secular and religious authority that would characterize the German imperial system for centuries. The palace chapel that served as his primary administrative institution combined governmental functions with religious observance in ways that embodied the fundamental unity of medieval Christian civilization. The cultural renaissance that flourished under Ottonian patronage built upon Carolingian foundations while developing distinctively German characteristics that reflected the empire's geographical position and political relationships. The court school established by Otto attracted scholars from throughout Europe, creating intellectual exchanges that contributed to advances in theology, law, natural philosophy, and artistic expression. The manuscript tradition that developed in Ottonian scriptoria preserved and transmitted classical texts while producing original works that would influence European thought for generations. The military reforms that Otto implemented created the foundations for German dominance in European warfare that would persist throughout the medieval period. His emphasis on heavily armoured cavalry supported by disciplined infantry formations established tactical principles that would be copied throughout Europe, while providing German armies with decisive advantages over their enemies. The castle-building program that he sponsored transformed the German landscape, while creating defensive capabilities that could protect his territories against future invasions. The economic developments that occurred during Otto's reign reflected the growing prosperity and stability that effective royal government could provide when external threats were eliminated and internal conflicts resolved. Trade networks that had been disrupted by Magyar raids were restored and expanded, connecting German territories with Italian cities and Byzantine markets. Agricultural production increased as farmers could work their lands without constant fear of nomadic attacks, while urban centers grew as craftsmen and merchants found new opportunities in the expanding economy. The legal traditions that Otto maintained and developed combined Germanic customary law with Roman legal principles and Christian ethical teachings, creating judicial systems that commanded respect from diverse populations while providing consistent procedures for resolving disputes and maintaining order. The royal courts that he established served as models for regional judicial institutions while providing appeals processes that strengthened royal authority over local administrators. The succession arrangements that Otto established for his son Otto II reflected his understanding of the lessons learned from Carolingian failures while adapting to the specific circumstances of German imperial governance. Rather than dividing his territories among multiple heirs, he designated his eldest son as sole successor while providing appropriate positions within the imperial administration for other family members. This approach preserved the unity of royal authority while satisfying Germanic traditions regarding the treatment of royal children. The reign of Otto II, from 973 to 983, revealed both the strengths and limitations of the imperial system that his father had established. The younger Otto inherited extraordinary resources and capabilities, but he also faced challenges that tested every aspect of Ottonian governmental innovations. His attempts to extend imperial authority deeper into Italy brought him into direct conflict with Byzantine forces and Muslim raiders who possessed military capabilities that German armies had never previously encountered. The Battle of Stilo in 982, where Otto II suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Muslim forces in southern Italy, demonstrated that even the most successful medieval military systems had limitations when confronted with unfamiliar enemies and unfavorable terrain. The emperor's narrow escape from capture and the destruction of much of his army created political crises throughout the empire, while revealing the dangers inherent in ambitious expansion beyond the geographical and cultural boundaries within which imperial authority could be effectively maintained. The death of Otto II at the age of only 28 created succession challenges that tested the stability of Ottonian institutions, while revealing the resilience of the governmental systems that had been developed over several generations. His son, Otto III, was still a child, requiring regency arrangements that had to balance competing claims from different branches of the imperial family while maintaining effective governance during a period of external threats and internal tensions. The regency of Theophanu, Otto II's Byzantine wife, represented one of the most remarkable examples of female political leadership in medieval European history. Her successful management of imperial affairs during her son's minority demonstrated that the Ottonian system possessed sufficient institutional strength to function effectively, even when traditional patterns of male authority were temporarily suspended. Her policies combined Germanic political traditions with Byzantine diplomatic sophistication, creating approaches to governance that influenced imperial development long after her death in 991. Otto III, who assumed personal rule in 994 at the age of 14, brought to the imperial throne a vision of Christian empire that was both more ambitious and more idealistic than anything attempted by his predecessors. His education had been influenced by both Germanic military traditions and Byzantine intellectual culture, creating a unique perspective on imperial possibilities that would inspire some of the most creative governmental experiments in medieval European history, while also contributing to political failures that would weaken Ottonian authority. The Renovatio Imperii Romane that Otto III proclaimed as his governmental program reflected his belief that the German Empire should become the direct successor to ancient Rome, while embodying Christian principles that had been unknown to pagan emperors. This vision required not just political and military dominance, but cultural and spiritual leadership that could unite all Christian peoples under imperial authority. His establishment of his court in Rome represented both a dramatic break with Germanic traditions and a bold attempt to create new forms of imperial legitimacy. The administrative innovations that Otto III implemented during his brief but intense reign included the appointment of foreign scholars and administrators to key governmental positions, creating an international character for imperial institutions that reflected his universal vision, while alienating German nobles who expected preferential treatment in imperial service. His patronage of learning and artistic expression produced remarkable cultural achievements, while straining imperial resources and creating political tensions that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The rebellion that erupted in Rome in 1001 revealed the practical limitations of Otto's idealistic vision, while demonstrating that medieval political systems remained fundamentally dependent on personal relationships and regional loyalties, rather than abstract principles of imperial authority. His death in 1002, at the age of only 21, ended one of the most creative and ambitious experiments in medieval European politics, while creating succession crises that would ultimately lead to the decline of Ottonian power. The election of Henry II as German king in 1002 marked the transition from Ottonian to Salian imperial traditions, while maintaining essential continuities in German political development. Henry's approach to royal authority emphasized practical governance over idealistic vision, focusing on administrative efficiency and military effectiveness rather than grandiose imperial projects. His policies would establish foundations for German dominance in medieval Europe, while avoiding the overextension that had weakened his predecessors across the Rhine in the Western kingdoms that would eventually become France. Different patterns of political development were creating alternative models of medieval royal authority that would influence European civilization for centuries. The rise of Hugh Capet to the French throne in 987 represented not just a dynastic change, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of royal power that would establish precedents for the relationship between kings and nobles throughout Western Europe. The Capetian monarchy that Hugh established differed significantly from both Carolingian and Ottonian imperial systems in its more limited territorial scope and its emphasis on feudal relationships rather than bureaucratic administration. Hugh's kingdom was smaller and less wealthy than the German Empire, but it was also more cohesive and more capable of sustained development because its political structures were better adapted to the realities of post-Carolingian European society. The gradual expansion of Capetian authority over the next 2 centuries would demonstrate alternative approaches to medieval state building that emphasized patience, diplomacy, and institutional development, rather than dramatic military conquests or idealistic governmental programs. The French model of royal development would ultimately prove more durable than the German imperial system, while creating political traditions that would influence European development well into the modern era. As the 11th century dawned, these competing models of medieval kingship had established the fundamental patterns that would define European political development for the remainder of our journey through the medieval world. The German Empire, the French monarchy, and the emerging Italian city-states each represented different solutions to the common challenges of governing diverse populations. In an age when transportation and communication remained primitive, while external threats and internal conflicts required constant attention from political leaders. The story of how these different political systems evolved, competed, and ultimately contributed to the rich diversity of medieval European civilization provides essential background for understanding the dramatic events that would unfold during the High Medieval period: the Crusades, the conflict between emperors and popes, the rise of urban centers, and the development of new forms of economic and social organization, all built upon the foundations that had been established during these formative centuries of medieval political development. Tonight, as these ancient voices fade into the gentle rhythm of your breathing, remember that the struggles and achievements we have witnessed represent more than historical curiosities. They reveal fundamental aspects of human nature and political necessity that continue to influence our world today. The medieval kings whose stories we have followed faced many of the same challenges that confront modern leaders: how to balance competing interests, how to maintain authority while serving the common good, how to preserve stability while adapting to changing circumstances, and how to create lasting institutions that can survive the inevitable transitions between generations of leadership. Their examples provide both inspiration and warning for anyone who seeks to understand the complexities of power and the responsibilities that come with authority in any age. The dawn of the 11th century brought with it a transformation that would reshape not just the political landscape of medieval Europe, but the very soul of Christian civilization itself. As you settle deeper into the embrace of rest, let us journey together into an age when faith and sword united in ways that would echo through eternity, when the call to holy war would draw kings from their thrones and peasants from their fields in pursuit of something far greater than earthly glory. The year 1095 found Europe at a crossroads of destiny. In the great cathedral of Clermont, Pope Urban II rose before a gathered multitude of nobles, clergy, and common folk to deliver words that would ignite a fire across the continent. His message was simple yet revolutionary. The holy places of Christendom lay under the dominion of infidel forces, and it was the sacred duty of every Christian knight to take up arms in their liberation. But this was more than a call to war. It was an invitation to transformation, a chance for warriors accustomed to fighting for land and gold to battle instead for the salvation of their very souls. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From every corner of Europe, men began sewing red crosses onto their garments, taking solemn vows to journey to the distant lands where Christ himself had walked. Kings abandoned their courts, nobles mortgaged their estates, and common soldiers sold everything they possessed to fund expeditions that would carry them thousands of miles from home toward an uncertain fate in foreign deserts and mountains. Among the first to answer this sacred summons was Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, whose very name would become synonymous with crusading virtue. Unlike many of his contemporaries who saw the expedition as an opportunity for territorial gain or political advancement, Godfrey appears to have been motivated by genuine religious conviction. He sold his vast estates to finance his journey, demonstrating a level of personal sacrifice that would inspire followers throughout the long and dangerous march to Jerusalem. The army that Godfrey assembled represented a fascinating cross-section of medieval European society. Alongside seasoned knights and professional soldiers, marched craftsmen and farmers, younger sons seeking their fortunes, and older men hoping to atone for past sins. Women accompanied the expedition as well, some as wives and servants, others as pilgrims in their own right, all united by the shared belief that they were participating in the most important enterprise of their age. The logistical challenges of moving such a massive force across thousands of miles of hostile territory were staggering by any standard, but particularly so in an age when military campaigns rarely extended beyond a single fighting season and seldom ventured far from familiar lands. The crusading armies had to traverse the Byzantine Empire, whose Greek Orthodox inhabitants viewed these Western warriors with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. Despite their shared Christian faith, Emperor Alexios Komnenos, who had originally requested papal assistance against Muslim expansion in Anatolia, found himself overwhelmed by the scale of the Western response to Urban's call. The disciplined knights and nobles who arrived at Constantinople were impressive enough, but they were preceded by waves of less organized pilgrims whose enthusiasm far exceeded their military capabilities or diplomatic sophistication. The tragic fate of the People's Crusade, led by the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit, provided a sobering preview of the difficulties that lay ahead. The crossing into Asia Minor marked the beginning of the Crusaders' education in the realities of Eastern warfare and the challenges of fighting in unfamiliar terrain against enemies whose tactics and equipment differed dramatically from anything they had previously encountered. The Seljuk Turks, who controlled much of Anatolia, were superb horsemen whose mobility and archery skills gave them significant advantages over European knights trained for close combat between heavily armored opponents. The siege of Nicaea in 1097 demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of crusading armies when confronted with sophisticated fortifications defended by determined garrisons. The city's walls had been built according to Byzantine engineering principles that made them nearly impregnable to direct assault, requiring the Crusaders to employ siege techniques that many of them had never previously used. The eventual fall of the city came not through military conquest, but through Byzantine diplomatic intervention. A reminder that success in the East would require more than simple martial prowess. The march across Anatolia tested every aspect of crusading organization and morale, as the armies struggled through harsh terrain under constant harassment from Turkish forces who avoided decisive battle while inflicting steady casualties through hit-and-run attacks. The extreme heat, lack of water, and unfamiliar diseases took a terrible toll on men and animals alike, while the psychological pressure of operating so far from home in hostile territory strained the bonds of fellowship and common purpose that held the expedition together. The victory at Dorylaeum restored crusading confidence while demonstrating that European military techniques could be adapted successfully to Eastern conditions when properly applied. The disciplined charge of heavily armored knights, coordinated with infantry support and backed by determined leadership, proved capable of breaking even the most skillful Turkish resistance when the tactical situation favored direct confrontation rather than prolonged maneuvering. The long siege of Antioch would become one of the defining episodes of the entire crusading movement, revealing both the extraordinary determination of the participants and the complex political dynamics that shaped their enterprise. The city's massive fortifications and strategic location made it impossible to bypass, but its capture required a siege lasting nearly 8 months, during which the Crusaders themselves came close to starvation and defeat. The discovery of the Holy Lance within Antioch's cathedral provided a dramatic moment of spiritual renewal that demonstrated the powerful role of religious belief in sustaining crusading morale during the darkest periods of the expedition. Whether the relic was genuine or fabricated by desperate clergy seeking to inspire their followers mattered less than its psychological impact on men who desperately needed reasons to continue their seemingly impossible quest. The leadership crisis that developed during the Antioch siege revealed the tensions between different national groups within the crusading armies and the competing ambitions of nobles who had not abandoned all worldly concerns despite their sacred vows. The dispute between Bohemond of Taranto and Raymond of Toulouse over control of the conquered city would establish patterns of political conflict that would plague crusading enterprises for centuries to come. The final approach to Jerusalem in 1099 represented the culmination of 3 years of extraordinary hardship and sacrifice, but it also marked the beginning of the most controversial phase of the entire crusading enterprise. The siege of the Holy City itself was relatively brief, lasting only 5 weeks, but the massacre that followed its capture would stain the crusading reputation for generations and create lasting animosity between Christian and Muslim populations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The establishment of the Crusader states in the aftermath of Jerusalem's conquest created an entirely new chapter in medieval political development, as European nobles attempted to create functioning governmental systems in territories whose populations, laws, and customs were entirely foreign to their experience. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli each represented unique experiments in cross-cultural governance that would influence medieval political thought far beyond their limited geographical boundaries. Godfrey of Bouillon's decision to refuse the title of king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns demonstrated the complex relationship between worldly ambition and spiritual devotion that characterized the best crusading leaders. His adoption of the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre reflected a genuine attempt to balance practical political necessity with religious humility, creating precedents for Christian rulership that would influence European concepts of royal responsibility for centuries. The military orders that emerged during this period represented perhaps the most innovative institutional development of the entire crusading movement. the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and later the Teutonic Knights, combined monastic vows with military service in ways that had never been attempted before, creating organizations that could maintain permanent garrisons in the East while developing the financial and logistical capabilities necessary to support ongoing operations thousands of miles from their European bases. The Temple of Solomon, from which the Templars took their name, became the symbolic center of their operations and the source of legends that would persist long after the order's controversial dissolution in the early 14th century. The knights who served there were bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that theoretically eliminated the personal ambitions and family loyalties that had complicated secular crusading leadership, creating military units whose discipline and effectiveness would become legendary throughout Europe and the Islamic world. The economic implications of maintaining permanent Christian settlements in the Eastern Mediterranean created new forms of international finance and trade that would influence European commercial development for centuries. The Italian maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa established trading privileges in Crusader ports that would make them among the wealthiest cities in medieval Europe, while the military orders developed banking systems that could transfer funds across vast distances with unprecedented security and efficiency. The Second Crusade, preached by Bernard of Clairvaux in response to the fall of Edessa in 1144, would demonstrate both the continued appeal of crusading ideology and the growing sophistication of Islamic resistance to European expansion. The participation of King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany provided the expedition with unprecedented royal leadership, but it also created new forms of political complexity as secular rulers pursued their own objectives alongside the stated religious goals of the enterprise. The disastrous outcome of the Second Crusade, which achieved virtually none of its stated objectives while suffering catastrophic losses in Anatolia, forced European leaders to reconsider both the practical methods and the theological justifications for holy war. The failure could not be attributed to lack of resources or inadequate leadership, since the expedition had enjoyed advantages that the First Crusade had lacked. Instead, it seemed to suggest that divine favor might no longer rest with Christian arms, a troubling conclusion that required careful theological explanation. The rise of Saladin as the dominant figure in Islamic politics during the latter half of the 12th century created challenges for the Crusader states that went far beyond simple military pressure. Saladin's combination of political skill, religious devotion, and military competence made him a formidable opponent who could unite previously fractious Muslim territories while presenting himself as a worthy adversary who fought according to honorable principles that Christian knights could respect even as they opposed him. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 represented one of the most decisive military defeats in crusading history, destroying the field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and opening the way for Saladin's reconquest of the Holy City itself. The capture of the True Cross during the battle provided powerful symbolic confirmation of the Christian defeat, while demonstrating that military success alone was insufficient to guarantee divine approval of any particular cause or leader. The fall of Jerusalem to Saladin's forces created a crisis throughout Christian Europe that would launch the Third Crusade, the most famous of all medieval holy wars. The participation of three of Europe's most powerful monarchs, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, promised to restore Christian fortunes in the East, while creating unprecedented opportunities for political and military cooperation among rulers who were often bitter rivals in European affairs. The death of Frederick Barbarossa while crossing through Anatolia deprived the Third Crusade of its most experienced military leader, while providing a sobering reminder of the dangers inherent in any Eastern expedition. The German emperor's drowning in a minor river demonstrated that even the most careful planning and elaborate preparations could be undone by simple accidents, that medieval medical knowledge and transportation capabilities were powerless to prevent the rivalry between Richard and Philip Augustus that dominated the Third Crusade, revealed how difficult it was to maintain unity of purpose among leaders whose political interests often conflicted with their crusading vows. Their dispute over the succession to the throne of Jerusalem created divisions within the Christian forces that ultimately prevented the recapture of the Holy City, despite significant military successes along the Palestinian coast. Richard's reputation as a military commander was established during the Third Crusade through victories that demonstrated the continued effectiveness of European military techniques when properly applied under competent leadership. His triumph at Arsuf showed that Saladin's forces, despite their earlier successes, remained vulnerable to well-coordinated attacks by disciplined Christian armies that could maintain formation under pressure while exploiting tactical opportunities with decisive action. The treaty that ended the Third Crusade represented a form of compromise that would have seemed impossible to the participants in the First Crusade, acknowledging that Christian and Muslim forces could coexist in the Holy Land under agreements that respected the legitimate interests of both sides. This diplomatic solution reflected the growing maturity of crusading leadership and the recognition that military conquest alone might not provide lasting solutions to the complex political and religious challenges of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Fourth Crusade, which culminated in the conquest of Constantinople in 1204, represented perhaps the greatest deviation from original crusading ideals as Western armies turned their weapons against fellow Christians in pursuit of territorial and commercial objectives that had little connection to the liberation of the Holy Land. The sack of the Byzantine capital created a scandal that would permanently damage relations between Eastern and Western Christianity, while demonstrating how easily religious enterprises could be corrupted by worldly ambitions. The Latin Empire, established in Constantinople following the Fourth Crusade, created new opportunities for European nobles seeking territorial advancement, while fragmenting Byzantine resistance to Islamic expansion in ways that would have long-term consequences for the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The short-lived Western dominion over the ancient imperial capital represented one of the most ambitious attempts at political transformation in medieval history, even as it revealed the limitations of military conquest, unsupported by genuine administrative capability or cultural understanding. The Children's Crusade of 1212, whether historical fact or later legend, captured something essential about the popular appeal of crusading ideology and the genuine religious enthusiasm that continued to motivate participation in holy war, despite the mixed results of official expeditions. The image of young people setting out for the Holy Land with nothing but faith to sustain them provided a powerful contrast to the increasingly political and commercial character of organized crusading enterprises. The Fifth Crusade, directed against Egypt rather than Palestine, represented a strategic innovation that recognized the importance of controlling the economic and political foundations of Islamic power, rather than simply attempting to capture symbolic religious sites. The temporary success of the expedition in capturing Damietta demonstrated the continued military effectiveness of European forces when properly supported and supplied. But the ultimate failure of the enterprise showed that strategic innovation alone was insufficient without corresponding improvements in logistics and political coordination. The remarkable career of Frederick II during the Sixth Crusade illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of diplomacy as an alternative to military conquest in achieving crusading objectives. His success in negotiating the return of Jerusalem through treaty rather than siege demonstrated that intelligent leadership could accomplish through negotiation what military force had failed to achieve. But his controversial methods and complex political situation ensured that his diplomatic triumph would be short-lived. The final loss of the Crusader states during the latter half of the 13th century marked the end of an era that had shaped European consciousness for nearly 2 centuries. The fall of Acre in 1291 eliminated the last major Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, but the crusading ideal would continue to influence European political and religious thought long after the practical objectives of the movement had been abandoned. The military orders that had emerged during the height of crusading success found new purposes in different theatres of operation, as the focus of holy war shifted from the Eastern Mediterranean to other frontiers of Christian expansion. The Teutonic Knights redirected their efforts toward the conquest and conversion of pagan peoples in the Baltic region, while the Iberian military orders continued their participation in the Reconquista that would eventually drive Islamic forces from the entire Iberian Peninsula. The intellectual and cultural exchanges that occurred during the crusading period created lasting connections between European and Islamic civilization that influenced medieval development in ways that extended far beyond military and political affairs. The translation of classical, philosophical, and scientific texts from Arabic into Latin provided European scholars with access to knowledge that had been lost in the West for centuries, contributing to the intellectual renaissance that would transform European universities and scholarly traditions. The economic networks established to support crusading enterprises created new forms of international commerce and banking that would outlast the military expeditions themselves, while contributing to the commercial revolution that transformed medieval European society. The Italian maritime cities that had profited from transporting crusaders and supplies would use their accumulated wealth and expertise to dominate Mediterranean trade for centuries, while the financial techniques developed by military orders would influence European banking practices well into the modern era. The architectural legacy of the crusading period can still be seen today in the massive fortifications that dot the landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean, testimony to the engineering skills and defensive innovations that emerged from 2 centuries of conflict between Christian and Islamic forces. Crac de Chevalier and other crusader castles represented the pinnacle of medieval military architecture, while demonstrating the resources and determination that European settlers invested in their attempt to create permanent Christian dominion over the Holy Land. The literary traditions that emerged from crusading experiences enriched European culture with new forms of narrative and poetic expression that would influence artistic development for centuries. The chansons de geste that celebrated crusading heroes provided models for vernacular literature that helped establish national literary traditions, while the chronicles written by participants in the expeditions created historical narratives that combined religious interpretation with eyewitness observation in ways that would influence European historical writing throughout the medieval period. As the 13th century drew to a close and the last Crusader strongholds fell to Islamic forces, medieval Europe found itself transformed by 2 centuries of holy war that had reshaped everything from military technology to international finance, from religious thought to artistic expression. The failure to maintain permanent Christian control over the Holy Land did not negate the profound impact that crusading enterprises had exercised on European development, creating institutions, ideas, and cultural patterns that would continue to influence Western civilization long after the military objectives of the movement had been abandoned. Tonight, as these echoes of ancient battles fade into the gentle silence of approaching sleep, remember that the crusading ideal represented more than simple military conquest or religious fanaticism. It embodied medieval Europe's attempt to unite spiritual aspiration with worldly action, to transform the violence that characterized feudal society into service of transcendent purposes, and to create forms of international cooperation that could transcend the narrow boundaries of local loyalties and tribal identities. The Crusades failed in their immediate objectives, but they succeeded in demonstrating human capacity for extraordinary sacrifice in service of ideals that extended beyond immediate self-interest. The knights who took the cross and journeyed to distant lands in service of their faith were neither perfect heroes nor simple villains, but complex individuals whose motivations combined genuine religious devotion with worldly ambition, whose actions reflected both the highest aspirations and the deepest flaws of medieval Christian civilization. Their stories remind us that human beings in every age struggle to balance competing loyalties and conflicting values, seeking ways to serve purposes greater than themselves while remaining true to the practical necessities of survival and success in an often hostile world. The twilight years of the crusading era witnessed the emergence of new forms of medieval kingship that would define European political development for centuries to come. As the 13th century unfolded, monarchs across the continent began to consolidate power in ways that their predecessors could scarcely have imagined, building administrative systems and legal frameworks that would transform the very nature of royal authority. In England, the reign of Edward I, who ascended the throne in 1272, exemplified this evolution toward more sophisticated forms of governmental organization. Edward understood that effective medieval kingship required more than personal charisma or military prowess. Though he possessed both in abundance, his approach to royal administration combined traditional feudal relationships with innovative bureaucratic procedures that created unprecedented capabilities for governing diverse populations across extensive territories. The conquest of Wales that occupied much of Edward's early reign demonstrated how 13th century military technology and administrative techniques could be combined to achieve permanent political transformation. Unlike earlier English attempts at Welsh subjugation, which had relied primarily on periodic military expeditions designed to extract tribute and hostages, Edward's campaign was conceived as a systematic program of territorial annexation, backed by institutional innovations that would prevent future rebellion. The castle-building program that Edward implemented throughout Wales represented one of the most ambitious military engineering projects of the medieval period. These fortifications were not merely defensive positions designed to protect English garrisons from local attack, but administrative centres that served as focal points for introducing English legal procedures, commercial practices, and governmental institutions to populations that had previously operated according to entirely different cultural traditions. Caernarfon Castle, perhaps the most magnificent of Edward's Welsh fortifications, was designed to serve symbolic as well as practical functions, its architecture deliberately echoing the walls of Constantinople to suggest imperial authority, while providing accommodations suitable for royal ceremonies that would demonstrate English dominance over the conquered territories. The investment of resources required for such elaborate construction revealed the scale of Edward's ambitions and his confidence in the permanence of his achievements. The legal innovations that accompanied Edward's territorial expansion established precedents for royal authority that would influence English constitutional development for centuries. The Statute of Wales, promulgated in 1284, systematically replaced Welsh customary law with English legal procedures, while preserving selected local practices that pose no threat to royal authority. This careful balance between innovation and tradition became a characteristic feature of English governmental development. The administrative challenges of governing Scotland proved far more complex than the Welsh campaigns, revealing the limitations of even the most sophisticated medieval governmental systems when confronted with populations whose national identity had already achieved institutional expression through established royal dynasties and ecclesiastical hierarchies. Edward's intervention in Scottish succession disputes, following the death of Alexander III, created opportunities for extending English influence northward, but it also triggered resistance that would persist for generations. The wars of Scottish independence that dominated the latter years of Edward's reign and continued under his successors represented more than simple territorial conflicts between competing monarchies. They embodied fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority and national sovereignty that would influence European political thought throughout the later medieval period. The Scottish insistence on maintaining independent royal dignity, despite English military superiority, established precedents for resistance to imperial domination that would inspire similar movements throughout Europe. William Wallace's victory over English forces at Stirling Bridge in 1297 demonstrated that sophisticated military technology and professional armies could still be defeated by opponents who possessed superior knowledge of local terrain, combined with desperate determination to preserve their political independence. The tactical innovations employed by Scottish forces, including the effective use of schiltron formations against English heavy cavalry, influenced military development throughout medieval Europe. The subsequent career of Robert Bruce illustrated how medieval political leadership could combine traditional feudal relationships with emerging concepts of national kingship to create new forms of governmental legitimacy. Bruce's transformation from English vassal to Scottish national hero required not just military skill and personal courage, but genuine understanding of the cultural and institutional foundations that could sustain independent royal authority in the face of overwhelming external pressure. The Declaration of Arbroath, issued by Scottish nobles in 1320, articulated concepts of popular sovereignty and conditional royal authority that were centuries ahead of their time, establishing principles that would later influence constitutional development throughout Europe. The document's assertion that kings ruled by consent of their subjects rather than divine right alone challenged fundamental assumptions about medieval political organization while providing theoretical justification for resistance to tyrannical authority. The French monarchy during this same period was developing alternative approaches to royal consolidation that emphasized legal sophistication and administrative efficiency rather than military conquest alone. Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, who ruled from 1285 to 1314, created governmental innovations that would establish France as the most administratively advanced kingdom in medieval Europe, while demonstrating new possibilities for royal authority over traditional feudal hierarchies. The conflict between Philip and Pope Boniface VIII over royal taxation of ecclesiastical property represented one of the defining moments in the medieval struggle between secular and spiritual authority. Philip's successful resistance to papal claims of temporal supremacy established precedents for royal independence from ecclesiastical interference that would influence European political development for centuries, while demonstrating that medieval kings could challenge even the most fundamental assumptions about religious authority when their vital interests were at stake. The establishment of the Estates General in 1302 represented Philip's recognition that effective royal government required some form of consultation with representatives of different social groups, even as he worked systematically to strengthen monarchical authority at the expense of feudal autonomy. This careful balance between centralization and consultation became a characteristic feature of French governmental development that distinguished it from both English parliamentary traditions and German imperial practices. The suppression of the Knights Templar between 1307 and 1314 revealed the extent to which royal authority had evolved since the height of the crusading period. As Philip successfully challenged one of the most powerful international organizations of medieval Europe through coordinated legal and propaganda campaigns that demonstrated new capabilities for royal administration. The charges brought against the Templars, whether genuine or fabricated, illustrated how medieval political leaders had learned to use accusations of heresy and moral corruption as weapons against opponents who might otherwise have proved invulnerable to conventional forms of pressure. The economic innovations that accompanied these political developments created new sources of royal revenue that reduced traditional dependence on feudal obligations and military service. The expansion of royal taxation, the development of more sophisticated commercial law, and the establishment of royal monopolies over certain forms of economic activity provided medieval monarchs with unprecedented financial resources, while creating new relationships between rulers and subjects that went far beyond traditional feudal bonds. The Italian peninsula during this period witnessed the emergence of entirely different forms of political organization that challenged conventional assumptions about medieval governmental structures. The city-states that dominated northern and central Italy had developed republican institutions and commercial practices that provided alternatives to both feudal hierarchy and monarchical authority, creating models of urban governance that would influence European political thought for centuries. Venice, perhaps the most successful of these urban republics, had created governmental institutions that combined oligarchic control with remarkably effective administrative procedures, enabling a relatively small city to exercise commercial and political influence throughout the Mediterranean world. The Venetian system of electing doges through complex procedures designed to prevent corruption, while ensuring competent leadership provided models for republican governance that would later influence constitutional development in other European contexts. The Papal States represented yet another form of medieval political organization, as successive popes worked to create effective temporal authority over territories whose spiritual and secular governance were theoretically unified under ecclesiastical leadership. The challenges of governing diverse populations, according to both religious principles and practical political necessities, created unique institutional innovations that influence both church administration and secular governmental development. The Avignon papacy, which began in 1309 when Clement V established his court in southern France rather than Rome, represented one of the most dramatic transformations in medieval ecclesiastical politics, while revealing the growing influence of national monarchies over international religious institutions. The papal court's residence under French protection created new opportunities for royal influence over church policies, while generating criticism from throughout Europe about the compromise of papal independence. The Great Western Schism that began in 1378, when rival papal claimants established competing courts in Rome and Avignon, created unprecedented challenges for European political leaders who found themselves forced to choose between competing claims to spiritual authority. The resolution of this crisis through the Council of Constance established new precedents for ecclesiastical governance, while demonstrating that even the most fundamental religious institutions could be reformed through careful political negotiation and institutional innovation. The emergence of new forms of warfare during the 14th century reflected broader changes in European society that were transforming traditional relationships between social classes and governmental institutions. The increasing effectiveness of infantry forces armed with crossbows and later firearms challenged the military dominance of heavily armored cavalry, while creating new opportunities for common soldiers to achieve social advancement through military service. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which began in 1337, represented more than a dynastic dispute between competing royal houses. It embodied fundamental questions about national identity, governmental legitimacy, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects that would influence European political development for centuries. The conflict's duration and intensity required both kingdoms to develop new forms of military organization, taxation, and administrative coordination that transformed their governmental capabilities. The English victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt demonstrated the tactical superiority of English military innovations, while revealing the limitations of traditional French feudal military organization. The effectiveness of English longbowmen against French heavy cavalry illustrated how technological and tactical innovations could overcome apparent disadvantages in resources and numerical strength when properly applied under competent leadership. The emergence of Joan of Arc as a decisive figure in French resistance to English occupation represented one of the most remarkable examples of individual charisma influencing medieval political development. Her success in convincing Charles VII to allow her military participation, followed by her role in lifting the siege of Orléans, demonstrated how religious inspiration could provide motivation for political and military efforts that might otherwise have seemed hopeless. The trial and execution of Joan of Arc by English and Burgundian authorities illustrated the complex relationship between religious authority and political necessity that characterized much of medieval European conflict. The charges of heresy brought against her reflected genuine theological concerns about female claims to divine inspiration, but they also served political objectives by discrediting French resistance to English occupation, while providing legal justification for eliminating a remarkably effective enemy leader. The gradual French recovery that followed Joan's death demonstrated the resilience of medieval political institutions when supported by effective leadership and popular commitment to national independence. The systematic reconquest of English-held territories required not just military success, but administrative innovations that could restore effective governance to regions that had experienced decades of warfare and occupation. The emergence of Burgundy as a major European power during the later phases of the Hundred Years' War illustrated how medieval political fragmentation could create opportunities for ambitious rulers to build new forms of territorial authority that transcended traditional feudal boundaries. The Burgundian dukes' success in uniting territories stretching from the Netherlands to central France created a political entity that combined the wealth of urban commercial centres with the military resources of rural feudal domains. The marriage alliances that connected Burgundian territorial expansion with broader European political networks revealed the continued importance of dynastic relationships in medieval diplomacy, while demonstrating how marriage could serve as an instrument of territorial consolidation and political alliance. The complex web of family relationships that linked ruling houses throughout Europe created both opportunities for peaceful cooperation and sources of potential conflict when dynastic claims conflicted with national interests. The technological innovations that transformed medieval warfare during the 14th and 15th centuries reflected broader changes in European society that were creating new relationships between different social classes and economic groups. The development of gunpowder weapons, improved metallurgy, and more sophisticated siege techniques required new forms of military organization, while creating opportunities for craftsmen and engineers to achieve social advancement through technical expertise. The rise of professional armies composed of mercenary companies rather than feudal levies represented a fundamental transformation in the relationship between military service and political obligation. These professional soldiers owed loyalty to their paymasters rather than feudal lords, creating new possibilities for military effectiveness, while also generating new challenges for maintaining discipline and preventing mercenary companies from becoming independent political forces. The economic changes that accompanied these military and political developments created new sources of wealth and new forms of social organization that challenged traditional feudal hierarchies. The expansion of trade, the growth of urban centers, and the development of more sophisticated financial instruments provided alternatives to land-based wealth, while creating opportunities for merchants and craftsmen to achieve political influence that had previously been monopolized by traditional feudal elites. The plague outbreaks that devastated European populations during the 14th century created demographic and economic disruptions that accelerated many of these social and political changes, while creating new challenges for governmental institutions. The massive population losses forced surviving communities to develop new forms of labor organization, while creating opportunities for social mobility that would have been impossible under normal demographic conditions. The peasant rebellions that erupted throughout Europe during the later 14th century reflected these changing social and economic relationships, while demonstrating that traditional forms of political authority were no longer adequate for governing populations whose expectations and capabilities had been transformed by demographic catastrophe and economic opportunity. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and similar uprisings in France and other European regions illustrated both the potential for popular political participation and the limitations of existing governmental institutions in responding to demands for social and economic reform. As the medieval period drew toward its close during the 15th century, the foundations had been laid for the political, social, and economic transformations that would characterize the early modern era. The governmental innovations, military developments, and cultural achievements of medieval kings had created institutional frameworks and intellectual traditions that would continue to influence European civilization long after the feudal systems that had defined medieval society had given way to new forms of political organization. Tonight, as these voices from centuries past fade into the gentle silence of approaching sleep, remember that the medieval kings whose stories we have followed were pioneers who created the institutional foundations and cultural traditions that continue to shape our world today. Their struggles with questions of authority and legitimacy, their innovations in governance and law, and their attempts to balance competing loyalties and conflicting values established precedents that continue to influence political development in our own time. The medieval world they created and the problems they faced remain remarkably relevant to anyone seeking to understand the complexities of leadership and governance in any era of human history. The Renaissance monarchs, who emerged from the ashes of medieval feudalism, represented a fundamental transformation in the very concept of royal authority, as kings like Henry VII of England and Louis XI of France pioneered new approaches to statecraft that would reshape European civilization. These rulers understood that the changing world of the late 15th century demanded different skills than those that had served their medieval predecessors, requiring not just military prowess and feudal loyalty, but sophisticated understanding of economics, diplomacy, and the emerging technologies that were revolutionizing both warfare and governance. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 marked more than just another dynastic change in the turbulent history of English royal succession. It represented the triumph of calculated political strategy over traditional feudal military power, as Henry's careful cultivation of supporters and his shrewd understanding of popular sentiment enabled him to defeat a king who possessed superior resources and more legitimate hereditary claims. The new Tudor monarchy that Henry established would demonstrate how intelligent leadership could transform apparent weaknesses into sources of strength through innovative approaches to royal administration and diplomatic relations. The administrative reforms that Henry implemented during his 24-year reign revealed his understanding that effective Renaissance kingship required systematic attention to governmental procedures and financial management that went far beyond the personal relationships and military obligations that had characterized medieval royal authority. His creation of new bureaucratic institutions, his careful monitoring of royal revenues, and his systematic approach to legal reform established precedents for royal governance that would influence English political development for centuries, while demonstrating new possibilities for monarchical authority in an increasingly complex world. Henry's approach to managing noble opposition illustrated the sophisticated political calculations that characterized Renaissance statecraft, as he combined traditional methods of reward and punishment with innovative techniques for monitoring potential threats and preventing conspiracies before they could mature into actual rebellions. His use of bonds and recognizances to ensure noble loyalty created financial incentives for peaceful behavior, while providing the crown with unprecedented leverage over aristocratic families who might otherwise have posed challenges to royal authority. The marriage alliance that Henry arranged between his eldest son, Arthur, and Catherine of Aragon demonstrated his understanding that Renaissance diplomacy required long-term strategic thinking that could adapt to changing international circumstances while maintaining essential objectives. The Spanish marriage was designed to strengthen England's position in European affairs while providing protection against French expansion. But Henry's careful negotiations also included provisions that would protect English interests if the international situation changed unexpectedly. The economic policies that Henry pursued throughout his reign reflected his recognition that Renaissance monarchs needed independent sources of revenue that could support royal authority without requiring constant negotiation with potentially hostile parliaments or assemblies. His encouragement of trade and commerce, his systematic exploitation of feudal revenues, and his careful management of royal estates created financial resources that enabled him to maintain effective government while avoiding the fiscal crises that had weakened many of his predecessors. The death of Prince Arthur in 1502 created succession challenges that tested Henry's political skills while revealing the complex calculations required for maintaining dynastic stability in an age when royal authority was becoming increasingly institutionalized, but remained fundamentally dependent on individual leadership and family continuity. Henry's decision to arrange Arthur's widow's marriage to his surviving son Henry demonstrated both his diplomatic sophistication and his understanding that Renaissance politics required flexibility in adapting to unexpected circumstances. The international situation that confronted Renaissance monarchs was far more complex than anything medieval kings had faced. as the emergence of powerful nation-states, the expansion of global trade networks, and the development of new military technologies created both opportunities and challenges that required entirely new forms of diplomatic and strategic thinking. The Italian wars that dominated European politics during the late 15th and early 16th centuries illustrated how traditional concepts of feudal obligation and territorial inheritance had become inadequate for managing conflicts that involved multiple kingdoms, sophisticated alliance systems, and military innovations that transformed the very nature of warfare. Charles VIII of France, whose invasion of Italy in 1494 initiated decades of international conflict, represented both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in Renaissance royal ambition. His campaign demonstrated that French military resources and organizational capabilities had reached levels that made major territorial expansion feasible, but his failure to consolidate his conquests revealed the limitations of traditional approaches to territorial acquisition in an age when effective governance required sophisticated administrative systems and genuine understanding of diverse populations and their particular needs and customs. The response of other European monarchs to French expansion illustrated how Renaissance diplomacy had evolved beyond medieval patterns of personal alliance and feudal obligation toward more systematic approaches to international relations that emphasized balance of power considerations and a long-term strategic planning. The League of Venice, that formed to resist French domination of Italy, included participants whose cooperation would have been impossible under traditional feudal systems, demonstrating new possibilities for international coordination, while revealing the complex calculations required for maintaining effective alliance systems. Maximilian I of Austria, whose long reign from 1493 to 1519 spanned the crucial transition from medieval to Renaissance political systems, exemplified both the opportunities and the challenges that confronted rulers during this transformative period. His inheritance of vast Habsburg territories provided him with unprecedented resources and strategic opportunities, but effective governance of domains stretching from the Netherlands to Central Europe required administrative innovations and diplomatic skills that went far beyond anything his medieval predecessors had needed to master. The marriage policies that Maximilian pursued throughout his reign demonstrated how Renaissance monarchs had learned to use dynastic alliances as instruments of long-term strategic planning rather than simple expedients for resolving immediate political crises. His arrangement of marriages linking Habsburg interests with Spanish, English, and other royal houses created a network of family relationships that would influence European politics for centuries, while establishing precedents for using matrimonial diplomacy as a systematic tool of international relations. The military innovations that emerged during Maximilian's reign reflected broader changes in European society that were transforming traditional relationships between social classes and governmental institutions. The development of professional armies equipped with firearms and artillery required new forms of military organization and financing that challenged feudal concepts of military service while creating opportunities for technical specialists and professional soldiers to achieve social advancement through competence rather than birth alone. The Italian campaigns that occupied much of Maximilian's attention revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of Renaissance military technology when applied to the complex political and geographical challenges of Mediterranean warfare. His conflicts with French forces and Venetian armies demonstrated that traditional Germanic military advantages could be neutralized by opponents who possess superior knowledge of local conditions, combined with innovative tactical approaches adapted to Renaissance weapons and battlefield realities. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, whose joint reign from 1479 to 1516 created the foundations for Spanish global dominance, represented perhaps the most successful example of Renaissance royal partnership, demonstrating how effective cooperation between monarchs could achieve territorial unification and international expansion that would have been impossible for individual rulers operating independently. Their careful coordination of Castilian and Aragonese resources enabled them to complete the Reconquista, establish Spanish authority in the Americas, and emerge as major players in European diplomatic and military affairs. The conquest of Granada in 1492, which eliminated the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, represented more than simple territorial expansion. It embodied new concepts of religious and political unity that would characterize Renaissance state-building, while demonstrating how systematic military pressure combined with diplomatic isolation could achieve objectives that had eluded Spanish rulers for centuries. The careful planning and resource coordination required for the Granada campaign established precedents for Spanish military organization that would later enable global expansion and sustained international warfare. The expulsion of Jews from Spanish territories in 1492 illustrated the dark side of Renaissance state-building, as Ferdinand and Isabella's pursuit of religious uniformity led to policies that eliminated productive populations while creating lasting damage to Spanish intellectual and economic development. Their decision reflected contemporary assumptions about the relationship between religious unity and political stability, but the long-term consequences would demonstrate the costs of prioritizing ideological conformity over practical considerations of economic and cultural diversity. The Spanish exploration and colonization of the Americas that began with Columbus's voyage in 1492 created entirely new challenges for Renaissance royal administration, as Ferdinand and Isabella found themselves governing territories whose geography, populations, and resources were entirely unlike anything European monarchs had previously encountered. The development of colonial administrative systems required innovations in law, governance, and economic organization that would influence European political thought for centuries, while creating new forms of international relationship based on systematic exploitation of distant territories and populations. The encomienda system that Spanish authorities established in the Americas represented an attempt to adapt feudal concepts of personal obligation and territorial control to colonial circumstances that bore little resemblance to European social and economic conditions. The system's evolution from theoretical protection of indigenous populations towards systematic exploitation revealed both the adaptability of European institutional forms and their tendency to serve the interests of dominant groups regardless of their stated humanitarian objectives. The wealth that flowed from American colonies to Spanish coffers created new possibilities for Renaissance royal power, while generating inflation and economic disruption that would ultimately weaken Spanish domestic development. The massive influx of precious metals enabled Spanish monarchs to finance military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives throughout Europe. But the failure to invest colonial wealth in productive domestic activities created long-term economic problems that would limit Spanish political effectiveness in later centuries. The religious reforms that Ferdinand and Isabella implemented throughout their territories reflected Renaissance concepts of royal authority that emphasized monarchical responsibility for the spiritual welfare of subjects, as well as their temporal governance. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition represented an extreme application of these principles, creating institutional mechanisms for enforcing religious conformity that would influence European religious and political development for centuries, while demonstrating how Renaissance state-building could enhance governmental capabilities for social control and cultural manipulation. The diplomatic achievements of Ferdinand and Isabella established Spain as a major factor in European international relations, while demonstrating new possibilities for systematic alliance building and strategic planning that went far beyond traditional medieval approaches to international affairs. Their marriage alliances with Portugal, Austria, and England created networks of family relationships that would influence European politics for generations, while providing Spanish interests with protection against French expansion and other potential threats to Iberian security. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire as a major European power during the Renaissance period created entirely new challenges for Christian monarchs, who found themselves confronting opponents whose military capabilities, administrative systems, and cultural traditions differed dramatically from anything they had previously encountered. The Ottoman expansion into the Balkans and Central Europe required European rulers to develop new forms of military organization and international cooperation, while adapting their governmental systems to the demands of prolonged warfare against sophisticated enemies. operating according to unfamiliar strategic principles. Suleiman the Magnificent, whose reign from 1520 to 1566 marked the height of Ottoman power, represented a form of Renaissance monarchy that combined Islamic governmental traditions with administrative innovations that enabled effective rule over vast territories populated by diverse ethnic and religious groups. His legal reforms, military organization, and cultural patronage created governmental systems that were arguably more sophisticated than those of most contemporary European monarchs, while demonstrating alternative approaches to Renaissance state building that challenged European assumptions about political development and cultural superiority. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 represented one of the most dramatic confrontations between Islamic and Christian military systems during the Renaissance period, as Suleiman's forces came closer than any previous Muslim army to achieving decisive victory over the heart of Christian Europe. The Ottoman failure to capture the city resulted more from logistical challenges and tactical miscalculations than from superior European military capabilities, revealing how narrow the margin often was between success and failure in Renaissance warfare and international relations. The naval conflicts that accompanied Ottoman expansion into the Mediterranean created new challenges for European maritime powers, while demonstrating how Renaissance military technology and organizational innovations were transforming traditional patterns of naval warfare. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, while occurring after Suleiman's death, represented the culmination of decades of naval competition that had required European powers to develop new forms of international cooperation and military coordination in order to maintain their positions in Mediterranean commerce and territorial control. The Protestant Reformation, that began with Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority in 1517, created religious and political upheavals that would test every assumption about Renaissance royal authority, while forcing monarchs throughout Europe to choose between competing claims to spiritual legitimacy that could not be reconciled through traditional diplomatic negotiations or military solutions. The religious divisions that emerged from the Reformation would create new possibilities for political alliance and conflict, while challenging fundamental concepts of governmental legitimacy and social order. Charles V, who inherited the Spanish throne in 1516 and was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, found himself ruling territories more extensive than any European monarch since Charlemagne, while confronting religious, political, and military challenges that required entirely new approaches to imperial governance and international relations. His attempts to maintain Catholic unity while governing populations that included growing Protestant minorities illustrated the complex calculations required for effective Renaissance statecraft, in an age when religious and political authority could no longer be assumed to support each other automatically. The wars that dominated Charles V's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of Renaissance military power when applied to the complex political and geographical challenges of governing diverse territories, while maintaining effective resistance to multiple enemies operating on different fronts simultaneously. His conflicts with France, the Ottoman Empire, and German Protestant princes required forms of military organization and strategic planning that went far beyond anything his medieval predecessors had needed to master, while revealing how international warfare was becoming increasingly expensive and logistically complex. The abdication of Charles V in 1556, when he voluntarily relinquished his thrones to his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand, represented an unprecedented acknowledgement of the limitations of individual royal authority, in an age when governmental responsibilities had become too complex and extensive for any single ruler to manage effectively. His decision to divide his territories reflected practical recognition that Renaissance political systems required specialization and regional adaptation rather than universal imperial control, establishing precedents that would influence European political development for centuries. As the Renaissance period drew toward its close during the late 16th century, the monarchical systems that had emerged from medieval feudalism had demonstrated both their capacity for adaptation and their continued dependence on individual leadership capabilities and dynastic continuity. The governmental innovations, military developments, and cultural achievements of Renaissance kings had created new possibilities for royal authority while revealing new challenges that would continue to test European political systems throughout the early modern period and beyond. Tonight, as these echoes of Renaissance ambition and achievement fade into the gentle embrace of sleep, remember that the monarchs whose stories we have followed were pioneers who created new forms of political organization and international relationship that continue to influence our world today. Their struggles with questions of religious authority and political legitimacy, their innovations in governmental administration and military organization, and their attempts to balance competing demands from diverse populations established precedents that remain relevant to anyone seeking to understand the complexities of leadership and governance in our own interconnected and rapidly changing global society. The Renaissance world they created through their vision, determination, and political skill provides both inspiration and warning for contemporary leaders who face similar challenges in adapting traditional institutions to revolutionary changes in technology, economics, and social organization. And so, my friend, as the last echoes of these royal voices fade into the gentle darkness, we reach the end of our remarkable journey through 1,000 years of medieval and Renaissance kingship from Clovis the Frank, taking his first tentative steps toward Christian monarchy in the ruins of Roman Gaul, to the Renaissance princes who would reshape Europe with their grand ambitions and sophisticated statecraft. We have witnessed the extraordinary transformation of European civilization through the lives of the men who wore its crowns. These were not the fairy tale kings of legend, sitting serenely on golden thrones, dispensing wisdom and justice to grateful subjects. They were flesh and blood, human beings who struggled with the same fundamental challenges that face leaders in every age: how to balance competing interests, how to maintain authority while serving the greater good, how to create lasting institutions that can survive the inevitable transitions between generations. Their successes and failures shaped not just their own times, but continue to influence the political traditions, legal systems, and cultural values that define our world today. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, carry with you the understanding that history is not a collection of dusty facts and distant dates, but a living tapestry woven from countless individual choices, noble aspirations, and human struggles that connect us across the centuries. The medieval kings whose stories have filled this gentle hour faced challenges remarkably similar to those confronting leaders today, and their examples provide both inspiration and wisdom for anyone seeking to understand the complexities of power, responsibility, and the enduring human quest for justice and meaning. Sleep well, knowing that the threads of their remarkable stories continue to weave through the fabric of our own lives, connecting past to present in ways both seen and unseen, until we meet again in another corner of history's vast and fascinating halls. May your dreams be filled with the echoes of ancient wisdom and the quiet satisfaction that comes from understanding our shared human story.